Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Brianna Menning, and I'm the Programs and Communications Manager at the Institute for Advanced Study. Thank you for joining us for today's event, Religious Identities and Polarization, which is part of our Spotlight series. The University of Minnesota Spotlight Series is a collaborative partnership between the Institute for Advanced Study, the University Honors Program, and Northrop to present lectures, panel discussions, exhibits, and other events throughout the academic year around timely topics of interest. The six-part 2020-21 series is focusing on polarization and identities, inspired both by the recent presidential election and the polarization that has appeared in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. In an environment in which conversations across different identities and ideologies are becoming increasingly contentious, we hope to model ways to create meaningful dialogue about these difficult but important topics for our students and community. The University of Minnesota Twin Cities is located on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. The university resides on Dakota land ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. The IAS acknowledges this place has a complex and layered history. This land acknowledgement is one of the ways in which we work to educate the campus and community about this land and our relationships with it and each other. The IAS is committed to ongoing efforts to recognize, support, and advocate for American Indian nations and peoples. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's three panelists. Emmy Kegler is a pastor, author, and speaker called to ministry at the margins of the church, especially among LGBTQ+ Christians. She serves as pastor of Grace Lutheran Church in Northeast Minneapolis, a small servant-hearted neighborhood congregation focused on feeding the hungry and community outreach. She is a co-leader of the Queer Grace community, a group of LGBTQ Christians in the Twin Cities, and is the founder and editor of the Queer Grace Encyclopedia, a curated collection of online resources around LGBTQ life and faith. As a pastor and writer, she is passionate about curating worship and theological practices that dismantle barriers to those historically marginalized by Christian practice. Thanks for joining us, Emmy. Next, we have Tahil Sharma, who is an interfaith activist based in Los Angeles who was born to a Hindu father and a Sikh mother. Following the Oak Creek, Wisconsin shooting of a Sikh temple in 2012, Tahil became involved in efforts for interfaith literacy and social justice through various organizations. The regional coordinator for North America with the United Religions Initiative, Tahil serves as one of the 3 interfaith ministers in residence for the Episcopal Diocese of Los Angeles, and as a board member for Sadhana, a coalition of progressive Hindus. He is also an Interfaith Youth Corps alum and is a contributing author to books including Co-Human Harmony, Using Our Shared Humanity to Bridge Divides, Hindu Approaches to Spiritual Care, Chaplaincy in Theory and Practice, and Acting on Faith, Stories of Courage, Activism, and Hope Across Religions. Thanks for joining us, Tahil. And last, Chris Stedman is a Minneapolis-based writer, teacher, and community builder. He is the author of IRL, Finding Realness, Meaning, and Belonging in Our Digital Lives, and Faitheist, How an Atheist Found Common Ground with the Religious. He has also written for publications including The Guardian, The Atlantic, BuzzFeed, Pitchfork, Vice, and The Washington Post. Previously the founding director of the Yale Humanist Community and fellow at Yale University, Chris also served as a humanist chaplain at Harvard University and worked for Interfaith Youth Corps. He currently teaches in the Department of Religion and Philosophy at Augsburg University, serves as the network of ELCA colleges and universities visiting lecturer, and is at work on a narrative podcast for iHeartMedia, due for release later this year. Thanks for joining us, Chris. Now I'll get into Zoom instructions before I introduce John. I swear I'm almost done with the introductions. If you have questions at any point during today's presentation for our speakers, you can enter them in Zoom through the Q&A feature. You can find that in the bottom of the Zoom menu bar if you are on a desktop computer, or in the top right if you're on a mobile device. You can also use the chat feature. To either send comments to the panelists or to introduce yourselves to each other and have conversations, you want to select all panelists as well as attendees when you use the chat. As has already been noted in the chat feature, if you're interested in using captioning, please click on the live transcript box. And now to introduce our moderator, John Rash. John Rash is an editorial writer and columnist. His Rash Report column for the Star Tribune analyzes media and politics, and his focus on foreign policy has taken him on international reporting trips to China, Japan, South Korea, Rwanda, Kazakhstan, Turkey, Lithuania, Kuwait, and Canada. John's commentary can be heard on WCCO AM on Friday mornings at 8:10 and on Wednesdays on Playing Politics, a podcast from the editorial board. He lives in St. Louis Park with his wife, 2 children, and a dog. Thanks so much for joining us today, John, and thank you to all of our participants for joining us as well. Take it away, John.
Well, thank you very much for the generous introduction and invitation to take part in this Spotlight series. And thanks to all of you taking the time and the interest to hear from our accomplished and compelling panelists today. So people of a certain age, that means me, grew up being told that it was never polite to talk about politics and religion. But it's impossible to address the complex components of polarization and identities, the subject of this Spotlight series, without talking about these themes and the way in which society's response to the sacred world shapes the secular one. Pollsters and political scientists and many savvy citizens, including certainly all of you tuning in today, see how different degrees of belief, including the fastest growing category of non-belief, is key to individual identities, as well as the increasing polarization that marks and at times mars our times. The Pew Research Center, for one, is well aware of the role religious issues play in US society, as evidenced by recent research characterized by these headlines: Americans' views on Trump, religion, and politics. Certainly an issue that was quite prominent in the 2020 election, continues as we gear up to the 2022 midterms, and one that is a constant conversation among many of us as society reacts to the rapid changes in our politics and in our overall society. Another headline: more Americans than people in other advanced economies say COVID-19 has strengthened their religious faith. As we continue in the COVID era, hopefully soon exiting it, this is something we certainly can and should explore today as well. Another headline: Americans far more likely to say evangelicals will lose influence rather than gain it under Biden. The fact that this question is being asked at all is perhaps reflective of how deeply divided our society is at this point on this issue. Another headline, short and yet stark and startling to some, and yet quite consequential, particularly in considering geopolitics: the global God divide, in terms of just how different parts of the world, Western Europe in particular, relative to the global South, as just one example, is in terms of their view of a deity and of the role of religion in society. And in the US, decline of Christianity continues at a rapid pace. That's something certainly many of us perhaps have observed that we're going to want to talk about, because these studies, and many more like them, suggest that America's faith journey, like the one many individuals travel, is profoundly important to forming identities, and while by definition can be a congregating dynamic, it often can be a polarizing one too. So let's get started by first hearing from our accomplished panelists, and then from a few questions from me, followed by your participation in the conversation via the Zoom Q&A link as previously discussed. And Brianna will get to those at the end and certainly in the middle of the conversation as well, and we'll leave plenty of time for that. But I thought we'd give, as we traditionally do, our panelists a few moments to talk about their own individual and institutional backgrounds and how they come at this discussion before we jump into questions. And Tahil, if you don't mind, we'd love to start with you today. So thank you.
Thank you so much, John. And thank you so much for the organizers of this really fascinating conversation we're about to have. My name is Tahil Sharma, and I would like to say that my story comes at a time when intersections mean everything. I was born at many intersections of my own that might be considered as confusing to some because they don't follow a singular path or way of looking at things. But I come to the space as a dual religious adherent. I come from a Hindu and a Sikh background. I come to the space as an Indian American, where I come as a bicultural person. I come to this with a sexual orientation of being bisexual. And I also come into the space being ready for everything that gets thrown my way, because I understand the value of being at intersections, because if you can't learn to acknowledge the entire person for who they are, you're not acknowledging them at all. And that comes with the work of what I do in community organizing and activism spaces through the faith lens, but it also comes through the work of deconstructing interfaith spaces and the privileges that they uphold. And that's some of the work that I get to do at the United Religions Initiative, which is the world's largest grassroots interfaith network of organizations around the world. With a background of over 1,000 chapters in 110 countries, it's no small feat to see that interfaith cooperation is a daily routine in the world. But it doesn't mean it doesn't come with any sort of criticism that requires us to really dig deeper in how we uplift and empower communities that are constantly marginalized. So that's the context that I bring to this space today.
Thank you very much. And boy, several questions just jumped out from that, but we're going to hear from your fellow panelists and then go to those and several others. And I thought that I would turn to Chris next. Again, thank you for joining us. And same beginning, if you will, in terms of your individual and institutional background here.
Yeah, sure. Well, I would just echo the gratitude to everyone involved in making this event happen today. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. I am so eager to be here to share, but especially to learn from my fellow panelists. So thank you for inviting me. I grew up non-religious. I had a sort of a journey in and out of religion over the years. I became a Christian on my own as an adolescent, a rather fundamentalist one. Eventually moved into more progressive Lutheran spaces as I was seeking a space where I could be myself as a queer person in a Christian space, and then eventually went to a Lutheran college to study religion, where I realized I actually wasn't religious. And so I sort of came out on the other end of that, feeling that, I had sort of turned to religion in my youth because I was looking for a space to sift through questions of meaning and purpose and to find a sense of place and identity. And yet, it really wasn't the sort of theology of the tradition that brought me in. And so, as an adult, that has really been the sort of focus, the primary focus of my work in life, is acknowledging that even people who fall outside of traditional religious categories still have the need to explore big questions of meaning and purpose and find a sense of place and identity in the world. And as was already sort of referenced earlier at the top of this conversation, the fastest growing segment of the religious landscape in this country is people who claim no religious affiliation. Now, within that group, it's sort of a catch-all category. And so within that group, you see a great amount of variety. A majority of those folks still say they believe in a God or a higher power, even though they don't consider themselves religious. And so there's a lot to disentangle there. But one of the things that, having worked specifically as a community builder with religiously unaffiliated people, and now teaching a required class on meaning. So I get a lot of students who are taking this class just because they have to meet a graduation requirement. So they're not necessarily drawn to a religion class on their own. One of the sort of segments of this broader religiously unaffiliated category that I am particularly interested in and concerned about, which I think is sort of most relevant to this conversation today, is not the folks who consider themselves atheist or agnostic or secular humanist. I myself consider myself an atheist and a secular humanist, but are rather the folks who say that they are nothing in particular. And we can get more into that as the conversation unfolds, but that has been especially over the last few years as I've been working with a group of sociologists, some at the University of Minnesota, so it's great to be here, to better understand this population. This has become something that I am eager to explore more. So I appreciate the invitation to be part of this conversation today.
Well, we appreciate you being here, and you mentioned this area of particular concern. And I also mentioned the Pew studies. I have a little bit of data that we'll jump into a bit, just in a broad strokes of the direction of these two cohorts. But first, let's hear from our third panelist. And again, thank you very much for joining us. And Emmy, again, same question, individually and institutionally, please tell us the direction that you come from to this conversation.
Gladly. And again, I'll share in my first two colleagues' joy and gratitude in being invited into this space and into what is a conversation that might not always be something that is at the forefront of our career and personal work, but is also very much influencing where each of our work is falling. I grew up a native Minnesotan in an Italian-American family, so Catholic from birth, naturally, but ended up in the Episcopal Church, which, and the interesting thing that I'm seeing in this space, as all three of us are going through different relationships with the faith with which we were raised or not raised, and through that process in our lives, I noticed that all three of us on this panel are also members of the LGBTQIA+ community, which fascinates me because one of the predominant narratives in culture and within religious practices is that religious practice and LGBTQIA identity are diametrically opposed. And it's so fascinating to me that I would think at least some coincidence, the three of us who have come to represent our different perspectives and experiences today all belong to that community in some way. And all of us have been working against, in different parts of our lives and in our work now, that incorrect narrative. And that narrative is very much what I was exposed to as I was coming up as a teenager. Like Chris, I spent a good amount of time in more evangelical traditions of Christianity before ending up a progressive Lutheran, although I am still there. So check in with me in 5 years, I suppose. But the interesting thing to me is that we are taught culturally, religiously, within our own context, within conversations with family and friends, that not only is religious practice diametrically opposed to LGBTQIA+ identities, but also it's diametrically opposed to science, to any sort of political liberalism, to any, that each faith is sort of siloed into its own and cannot cooperate with others, which is particularly a strong narrative within Christianity. And my life experience has led me to a place where all of those things are coming together like many rivers into one, where I am a lifelong practicing Christian in various denominations and forms, that I now serve full-time as a pastor with great joy and honor, that I am joyfully married to my incredible wife, whose background in science led her to be a veterinarian, and I was raised in a very politically liberal family, and that a lot of the work at my current church with our food shelf outreach is interfaith, is by nature designed to go across borders and to not consider ourselves restricted by religious practice. What I've found in my experience is, although people want to treat religion and these other categories as opposed to each other, for me they come together almost creating this whitewater rafting experience, if we're thinking about it in the form of many rivers, where you have to do a great deal of navigating, and it's good to have a team that you can trust, but at the same time it's a great adventure. And as that work of recognizing that this belief that religion is diametrically opposed to these other categories, as that work and that understanding disseminates, as we begin to understand better culturally and within religious contexts, that we can celebrate and affirm the lives of LGBTQIA people, that there are deep-rooted connections between liberal or radical or progressive forms of politics and Christianity and other forms of religion. As we begin to recognize that, I see the whitewater rafting experience turning into something much more like the Mississippi, where many rivers continue to join it, from Minnesota all the way down to Louisiana, in a way that is not dangerous and creates, of course, creates points of danger, but also creates a way in which so many things can be ferried. So many different ideas and people can be quite literally conveyed. And that's part of the work that I do, is figuring out how do we get through the rougher parts, the parts where it feels like whitewater rafting, into a place that feels much more calm and can convey important messages, ideas, and people.
Well, terrific. And thank you so much for sharing that. And you made the point that I'm going to quickly jump into because of this commonality that you just described, that you shared. And, you know, as we all know, in following the news this week, Pope Francis reaffirmed the Catholic Church's position to a certain degree on issues of recognizing same-sex unions as just one example of how that particular issue plays a role in the public expression of faith, but also may play a role in terms of people forming identities and in terms of the polarization in society. So on that issue, and then from a broader perspective, please, cultural issues that seem to roll and roil through our society. To what degree is this at times collision between the culture and the church or the mosque or the temple, or in people who don't have a faith tradition, you know, how they approach it? How is that playing into this broader theme? And Tahil, we'll start with you, if you will, please.
Of course, we should start with, you know, the culmination of two religions and how complicated that can get, and then go into the easier journeys. So that makes sense. I come from two traditions that talk about, you know, the inclusion and interconnectedness of all creation. And Hinduism and Sikhism do it in very different ways. The pluralism of Hinduism demonstrates that people can connect with and understand the divine in a multitude of different ways. Therefore, we can affirm that all of their approaches are acceptable and can be deemed as a part of the human experience in connecting with the divine. And equally at the same time, as a part of that history, is an acknowledgement that there were people who identify in our modern construct as a part of being in the LGBTQ community. We don't have to make up that idea. We literally have religious texts to mythology, to temples that are built in stature and in grandeur that prove that point. It is up to the point of the last several centuries in particular, where we do see this connection between a conservative ideology and interpretation to the impacts of colonial rule in South Asia that impact the understanding of how these traditions deal with LGBTQ individuals and couples and communities now. We have a concept of the Hijra community, a community that encompasses a multitude of different folks that might be LGBTQ, particularly trans, or that might be of other identities, that somehow get grouped together and are deemed either very holy and untouchable or very unholy and untouchable. And that's not fair to them in any way, shape, or form. And right now, with a lot of the conservatism that comes out of patriarchy, toxic masculinity, and the approaches at which Hinduism comes into this space, it can be very challenging to actually live into this idea that being Hindu and bisexual is not something to compete with each other. One does not overrule the other. It's this idea that they can coexist peacefully and wonderfully inside this vessel that the divine has created. The problem with that, unfortunately, is this idea that there are no clear ways in Hinduism of how we understand what is a binary concept that we keep talking about. When there is no concept of a binary nature within the tradition itself, how is someone going to suddenly come up and say that that is the way that everything works? Unfortunately, you can't make that argument in Hinduism. Sikhism talks about it very differently in that it doesn't talk about sexuality at all. The closest thing that it might talk about is the idea that the bride is the soul that connects with God, that is the husband at all times. But in no sense does it ever demonstrate that we should discriminate or dehumanize or oppress or ostracize communities of folks that are a part of the LGBTQ community. But with that said, the same patriarchy and toxic masculinity that's a part of a social and a cultural norm prevents couples from being accepted in spaces, prevents the practice of traditions like the Anand Karaj or the wedding ceremony that allows people to be in the union with God. And if you don't allow those spaces to take place, unfortunately, and in some cases, fortunately, those communities, those identities, and those traditions will begin to dissipate. as they should, in my opinion, because we live into religion and spirituality as an ever-changing process and experience. If you're not relevant now and you disappear, you are not meant to exist. And there will be new traditions and communities that will come to exist in replacement of that affirm us as the entire beings as a part of this creation. And I know I'm saying things that might get me in trouble, but such is life. I encourage my colleagues to do the same because I don't want to be alone in this.
Well, no trouble here. This is an academic discussion, and this is why we do this with a sophisticated audience. And, you know, among the many interesting aspects of what you just shared was, in effect, saying that Sikhism doesn't talk about sexuality. Emmy, of course, Christianity does, and yet there are dramatically different interpretations of that. And, you know, to what degree has that played into the schisms that exist, and perhaps, if you perceive this, might be growing among different denominations and different directions within the Christian faith?
Indeed. Yeah, when the most recent statement from the Catholic Church came out, I mentioned it to my wife, who was raised in a Catholic family, and we both just sort of looked at each other like, yes, we knew this is where the Catholic Church currently stood on same-gender marriage, much as we would like to hope from some of the more welcoming statements we've heard from this particular Pope in the past few years that perhaps progress was happening, but we knew catechetically that was not what we were looking at. And the Christian Church has been the home of so many schisms over so many centuries, and particularly I think could almost be defined by its capacity for schism and developing and encouraging the development of new denominational affiliations. Particularly, we see that in America when we start mixing in that sense of independence and that sense of frontier ideology, where we think about, you know, sort of a man can be an island unto himself, to use patriarchal language. I think the Christian Church is certainly not new to schism. What we're seeing happening in a good number of mainline denominations and in some evangelical denominations as well is that the conversation around the inclusion of people who are in same-gender marriages, as well as people who identify outside the expectations of what we understand as a cisgender identity, that each denomination has different methods of dealing with conflict within itself, and through those methods, different activist communities have been rising up and saying the time has long passed for us to deal with these questions. Of course, it's not limited simply to sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. We're also starting to questions about women's ordination still rise in a great deal of denominations and have caused schisms even within the past 30 years. Questions about sexual purity, understandings of purity culture have also been causing a great deal of strife, although we haven't specifically had a schism over it in any denominations that I know of. But in particular, it's understood to be an ideologically divisive issue. And interestingly, it does not always come down to theology in the way that perhaps schisms were often phrased before. It comes down to a much more practical, personal, and experiential participation in faith, which then distinguishes exactly what kind of argument you're making. This is not necessarily, although I don't want to deride an argument about filioque in any of the creeds, but it's not happening on that sort of philosophical and ideological level. We're talking about our people and actual consequences on their lives. And that shifts what schisms look like and what those discussions look like a great deal.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And Chris, I'm going to turn to you and pivot the question a little bit in terms of, to what degree in your research, in your experience, in your observation, is the mix of these secular questions within the sacred space, is this contributing to the rise in those who are either atheist, agnostic, don't choose a faith, this growing cohort that you have paid particular personal and professional focus toward?
Yeah, the nuns, which we should be clear, I'm saying NONESs, not NUNSs, especially in conversations around religion. That distinction is really important. But yeah, I mean, I'm interested in the way that this conversation, I mean, it's not surprising to me, given the composition of this panel, that that we're paying particularly close attention, just based on our own personal histories, to LGBTQ identity. But it's not just because of our personal identities. This has really been a defining social issue of the last 20 years in this country. It was one of the fastest sort of shifts in public opinion in the history of human civilization. and so it's a great sort of way to enter into this conversation of how our very quickly shifting social landscape is changing our understanding of religion and how it's impacting religious life in the United States. And I come at this from two places. I may be a professional atheist, but my boyfriend is about to be ordained as a priest, Episcopal priest. So I have a sort of close-up view of some of these dynamics within Christian spaces. I also have a personal history, having really benefited from finding affirming spaces as an adolescent, sort of making my way through these questions. And I think it is important. I think in this conversation around polarization, we have to be really clear about the fact that when these discussions happen on a sort of broader cultural level, certain voices are privileged over others. The sort of loudest and most contentious voices come to define the conversation. So a group like the Westboro Baptist Church, which is a really small and marginal group within Christianity, comes to have outsized influence in shaping public imagination of what Christianity is and what Christians have to say about LGBTQ identity. And so, like, I think looking at the Catholic Church, for example, if you were to ask a random person, what does the Catholic Church think about, or what do Catholics think about LGBTQ identity? Most people would probably say that Catholics are more likely to be anti-LGBTQ than the average person. But actually, if you look at the data, among Catholics, a higher percentage of Catholics support both legal protections for LGBTQ individuals and also support their right to live their life in the way that they choose than among the general public. And so part of what defines the public's understanding of Catholicism is this disconnect between who's speaking for the tradition and who is sitting in the pews. And that, I think, is sort of one factor in this polarization conversation. And yet, to sort of get to your particular framing of this question, I think that social issues also, we give them a little too much credit in terms of the rise of the nuns. It's true that if you look at the data on the nuns, a majority of religiously unaffiliated people do say that they think that most religious traditions are too bound up in money and politics. You see all of, that their views on religious institutions and whether or not they're sort of acting hypocritically or living out their values have perhaps played a role. But if you look at the data, you also see that a majority of religiously unaffiliated people say they're not looking for a religious tradition at all. They're not, and there's this idea that they'll kind of make their way back into these institutions as these institutions catch up with certain cultural norms. And I think that's really not guaranteed. I think that, when we see the sort of growing number of people who say that they're not religious, some of it is a backlash or a reaction to knee-jerk conservative politics within various religious traditions. But I think more of it is this broader cultural shift that's happening, where we are sort of more broadly leaving this more institutional way of organizing our lives and moving to these sort of loose networks. So, because we're seeing this play out in religion, but we're also seeing it play out in our political lives and in all sort of other parts of our lives. And so I think it's true that some of it has to do with polarization, some of it has to do with the politicization of various religious denominations and who's spoken for them. All of these things, I think, are absolutely factors. But I think even if you take that all away, what we're actually seeing with the rise of the religiously unaffiliated is that people are leaving institutions not because they think that they are hypocritical or don't act, in alignment with their values, but because that model of being in community is not one that is resonating, especially with younger people. And I think some churches, synagogues, mosques, etc., have this idea that if we just change the way we do community, young people will come back. But I actually think it's not simply a matter of reforming the institutions. It's something that was said earlier. I think some of these ways of orienting identity and being in community are going to die off, because I think that we are shifting as a society the ways that we organize ourselves, and that is less of a religion specific thing and more something that is happening more broadly that is also impacting religion. So there's a lot more I could say there, but I'll leave it at that.
Indeed, and we're going to turn back to you to say some more. And thank you very much for that, Chris. And Emmy, I'll turn to you and then to Tahil, but to put some quantitative context to this broader cultural shift, as Chris describes it. I mentioned the Pew Research Center before, and they've been asking the same question every year. And to give a decade-long view, those who identify as Christian in the latest Pew survey is 65%, which is still a significant majority, especially in a nation riven with divisions. And yet just in one decade, that's down 12 percentage points from what it was. Those who would be the nones, atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular, self-described, is up to 26% from just 17% a decade ago. What's happening here?
What's happening here? My goodness gracious. I mean, there's an entire shelf at Barnes & Noble trying to answer that question. There's been some really fantastic work. I'm thinking particularly Kaya Oakes's writing on talking about what is this religious shift in America. And we are unquestionably shifting away from a cultural expectation of participation in religious communities in general and in Christian communities specifically. That was an expectation, as you know, it was simply expected that you participated in a religious community. There were, I mean, I've seen bulletins from church congregations going back to, I think, as recently as the 1970s, where they printed the member lists on the back of the bulletin at the annual meeting every year, and also the amount that person contributed that year. This was an expectation. If you were running for any sort of political office, you listed your religious participation, you listed the church that you went to, or to some extent we got to a point where we could list also synagogue, mosque, and temple, but I mean, Christianity really kept its primacy. There have been multiple points of erosion. The Catholic Church particularly has taken significant hits over the sexual and pedophilic scandals in the past few decades. Numerous denominations are, losing people in particular because of their opposition to the inclusion of LGBTQIA people, which is becoming much more accepted under younger generations. I think Chris is also hitting something on the head here about the way that we curate and create community. And in particular, that people now have opportunities for community outside of religious organizations that they might not have had before. 40 years ago in Minnesota, you would not have been able to find activities going on a Sunday morning. That was reserved for Christian practice. You wouldn't have been able to schedule sports on a Wednesday night. That was for confirmation class for middle school and high schoolers. And now you have yoga studio. I mean, you don't, not now, but a year and a half ago, we had yoga studios, coffee shops, also AA groups, all sorts of places where we curate community that acts with compassion, that provides services clearly, that encourages us to self-reflect and then transform in ways that we understand we've failed, that does that in a compassionate, forgiving, but ultimately challenging way. All of these things that we were used to finding in religious or in organized religion, and particularly especially in America and in Minnesota within Christianity, are being found elsewhere and no longer have requirement of certain membership expectations, participation, ideologic subscriptions. There are all sorts of things that are happening to fill that in a different way. And people are feeling like they can opt into those.
As the father of a high school swimmer and a junior high hockey player, I can attest to the church conflicts on Sunday morning and Wednesday nights, that's for sure, with youth sports and with so many other aspects. And Tahil, I'm going to turn to you, and please feel free to comment broadly on this issue in terms of what you see happening. But if you could also share a particular focus of the two faith traditions that you grew up with and the degree that this dynamic within the Christian church is replicated in those, or are in Hinduism and Sikhism, are they resistant to some of these broader shifts?
The Hindu and Sikh traditions are definitely not traditions that we can say are anywhere near being institutionalized like the way the Christian church is in Catholic, Orthodox, or Protestant form. And that comes from the history of the role of individual interpretation and pluralism in the approaches to both of those traditions. There's this idea that the individual plays the most powerful role in understanding their connection to the divine. And in that process, though, I don't think that's necessarily prevented individual temples from being able to latch on to that bureaucratic nature by making sure that they, follow the 501c3 standards and the like in a country like the United States, so that they can make sure to collect money and sort of keep their community afloat. But I think they've also taken on the nuance of appeasing those that are of the Christian majority to make sure that, that is how pluralism is going to work, is if the Christian, white, elder, rich person sits in the middle of the interfaith movement and throws the money at us, that we can keep our work going and our community is going to stay strong. It's not how the individual communities might work on the ground, but it's definitely what that looks like in interfaith spaces. And it can be a really big challenge to question that, because it's been the center of the interfaith movement for the last century in North America. That Christianity and white supremacy indirectly plays a role in how the interfaith movement is functioning now. And it's because that is where the locus of power sits. If people want to relinquish that power, especially to communities like my own, where we often are misrepresented, misunderstood, misaligned, and dehumanized oftentimes, that we need to have a better approach as to giving them the leadership, the power, the opportunities, and the approaches to where they can be uplifted. It's very easy to say that, I sit in a position within the Episcopal Diocese of Los Angeles as an interfaith minister. I'm in no way, shape, or form Christian. But at the auspices of the Bishop of Los Angeles, I am able to hold myself as someone who is not of the tradition, to be able to talk about the role that my communities play in improving and embettering the world. And having that kind of privilege does come at the cost of still answering to the bureaucracy that the diocese has to offer in terms of how events need to get done. Oftentimes it might feel that we might just be folks that people want to listen to us and they get really inspired, but they don't really act on those decisions because we're young, we're still emerging leaders, we are still in the process of getting our feet wet in this work. And I kind of call BS on that, because no one asked them to give leadership to us. We took the leadership for ourselves. And that actually means we have to take a better approach at acknowledging how we can continue to change the movement as it's going forward. I think, to the relevance point that I made before, it also means that if you want folks to participate in the interfaith movement that come from marginalized backgrounds, whether they're ethnic or cultural or religious, then give them the center, see what their needs are, see how you can uplift them, so that you can actually see a more robust movement for change and justice.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I know several people out there perhaps want to share their thoughts and certainly their questions. So I'm going to ask one more round of the panelists here and then begin to turn to audience questions. So please feel free to queue up and get your question ready, because I know the panelists would really like to hear from you as well. But, we're talking about polarization and identities throughout the Spotlight series here, and with this particular focus on religious identities or non-religious identities, one cannot avoid the key question, particularly after such a deeply divisive election, on the role that religion, and in particular different denominations and different faith traditions, is increasingly playing in American politics. And Emmy, I'll turn to you for your analysis, clearly cognizant that, you're speaking from your faith tradition, your perspective, and not for the entire Christian church, but analyze what you see happening here. And then I, of course, want to hear from Tahil and Chris as well on this issue.
I'm trying to give as judicious and expansive an answer as I possibly can, because coming from particularly a class of people, specifically the LGBTQIA community, in which there is much stronger representation and protection for us in one political party than another, it's sometimes difficult for me to speak with the most moderate clarity, shall we say. I think one of the things that we are seeing right now, especially if we look at the rise and the change in politics in the past decade and so, with first the rise of the Tea Party and then in the past 4 years with the rise of QAnon, is the way that Christian language has been much more insidiously co-opted to support particular political platforms. In particular, you see this happening with the QAnon processes and the way that it's reclaimed or picked up on some of the language within evangelical Christianity, and not always specifically aligned to that with Christianity, or done so in ways that are very much aligned with apocalyptic visions of Christianity, understandings of the rapture and other conversations culturally that became prevalent within the last 25 years. So what I think we are seeing is a great deal of anxiety within the Christian church about the way it's losing power. It's losing power in the sense that it's losing people, and it's losing power in the sense that the more perhaps conservative branches within Christianity believe they're losing the culture wars. The Christian culture wars have been varied across decades and centuries in this country. You can talk about Christian culture wars over abolition and slavery, in which very faithful Christians quoted scriptures on all sides of the issue around the African slave or the Atlantic slave trade. You can see it happening in conversations around segregated schools and cross-city busing in the 50s and 60s. You can see that kind of language popping up in multiple places where the church and different forms of it binds itself up with particular political ideals and then follows them as if they are gospel. And in particular, what we're seeing now is a great deal of anxiety is if we are losing numbers, if we are losing cultural power, how do we regain it? As someone very deeply in love with scripture and deeply in love with the person that we know, with the embodiment of God that we know of in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, who specifically abdicated power, I have some questions about these particular forms of Christianity. But that's taking me more into theological reflection than into political midline reflection, so I'll step back from that.
Well, thank you for sharing that very much. And Tahil, I want you to please address the question, including how this is often framed among different denominations and faith traditions within Christianity, and to what degree that the increasing cross currents between faith and politics is seen by people who have a sacred life in your faith traditions or others, but aren't part of the Christian community and the different dynamics within it.
Three types of communities actually come up when it comes to, I would argue, Hindu and Sikh communities, but also I think South Asian communities at large. One is the community of fear that becomes more insular. In a post 9/11 reality in particular, but I think historically, since the exodus of numerous South Asians coming to Ellis and Angel Island in the 1880s, we do notice that there's a community of people that have to remain in fear because they are an misunderstood minority. So they refuse to be able to engage with most parts of society. The second is the community of appeasement, knowing that they have to hang on the coattails of those that are in power, mainly those that are white, mainly those that are rich, mainly those that are Christian, to be able to have a sense of how they're able to get through in community and to be able to save their own asses, to put it bluntly. And third is the community of activism, the one that is unabashed by any of this and is willing to go out of their way to stand on the front lines. The problem is there is a dichotomy in each one that has a different relationship with religion. The first one says, I'm deeply connected to my religion, but I don't want to lose it. The second one says, I'm connected with my religion, but I also have a theology of convenience that lets me make a bunch of exceptions in my head. And the third one may not actually have any association with religion because it acknowledges the inherent issues that religiosity can bring into the space. So activism on a secular level actually will function better and more efficiently than getting religious stakeholders involved. So how do I stand in the middle of this? Well, I do definitely come from the third category. I would say my parents in some ways come from the first category. I know a lot of people in the second category for sure, but I don't need to name names. But what's important to me is understanding that the sociocultural nature, the sociopolitical nature of how I have to engage in my Hinduism and Sikhism is not supposed to be compared to this exoticized nature of the thousands of years of religion that I come back to from South Asia. Because as it is changing, so am I. Therefore, my practice and open practice in particular of these religions means I have to be in the public square fighting for the rights of others for me to feel like I'm actually genuinely being religious. There's no other way around that for me. My prayers aren't being answered if I don't see the rights of others actually being achieved. It's not fair for me to ring the name of God at all times and saying like, oh, things will change one day, things will change one day. There are scriptures that keep reminding us that we actually have the power as being a part of creation to make things better. And that actually also reminds us that even in the spaces of activism, religious stakeholders need to make sure they work with atheist, agnostic people and secular humanists. In the interfaith movement, we're actually lacking this very unfortunate reality that we can only unleash the holy when we only do it with religious people. Like we can only fight for justice if only religious people are involved. I think that's complete nonsense because you're leaving out a significant set of people that are a part of this fabric. And those are people who do not follow the same ethics or frameworks of a religion or of a practice. They're still a community in their own unique ways. And if you don't invite them into the space without like trying to proselytize to them or trying to make yourself seem better than them, then what's the expectation? We're actually not living out the full justice that we want to anyway. That is the divisive nature that we're creating, even within our own communities like Hindus and Sikhs, unfortunately. We look at people that are not religious and they're like, oh, they're off the beaten path. They don't know what they're doing. They're confused and concerned. They say the same things about me, and I'm a dual religious person. I got double the power, and they still have a problem with me. So if the point is I'm not trying to be there to satisfy people in my community, I'm there to live out and manifest what God has intended me to do, then I'm going to do that with every person shoulder to shoulder. I'm not going to hold back just because people are uncomfortable with it.
Well, Chris, when he speaks about that, of course, these are some of the people that you have made an academic, focus and certainly understand very deeply. Pick up on some of Tahil's comments there, and then from a broader perspective, please. We've talked about how people from the Christian community, might be viewing this religious political divide that's amplifying in our society, and from people of faith, but who aren't from a Christian community. How about people, who aren't practicing as you see?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the non-religious definitely do face our fair share of misconceptions, and not to confirm any, but I am a little confused sometimes that, that is, I don't have it all figured out. And I think I think that's true among a lot of religiously unaffiliated people. What I will say is a few things. First of all, I think that, I mean, I absolutely agree that, conversation across lines of religious difference, including lines between people who consider themselves religious and those who do not, is immensely valuable. That's been a big focus of my work and something that I've gotten a lot of personal fulfillment out of being a part of. And actually, I was reminded as you were speaking just a moment ago, um, I'm not Lutheran, but I have spent formative time in Lutheran spaces. I teach in a religion and philosophy department at a Lutheran affiliated university. And when I was studying religion, my advisor was a scholar of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a Lutheran theologian. And I was thinking of Bonhoeffer's words as you were speaking, because Bonhoeffer, for those who aren't aware, Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran theologian living in Germany at the time of the rise of the Nazis. And he had this idea that Christians have an obligation to live as if there is no God. And what he meant by that is that Christians should not simply sort of appeal to God to intervene in human affairs, but rather, if they see injustice, that is their responsibility to act, to work to discern God's will and then act on God's behalf in the world. And for him, that meant participating in an attempt at assassinating Hitler, which is ultimately why he was imprisoned. And for me, that's the place where non-religious and religious people often can sort of meet, is in that work. We may come into it for different reasons, we may have different motivations, but ultimately, by sort of coming together and working together, we have a chance to better understand the different motivations that bring us all into that work. But this, I think, sort of leads to my big concern about the communities that I'm a part of, which is the sort of broad catch-all category of the religiously unaffiliated, who I've been working with professionally for a decade and working to study and try and better understand. When I look at the rise of the religiously unaffiliated and how quickly the number of people who say that they're not religious in the United States is growing, I see those numbers and I feel concern, which sets me apart a bit from some of my other atheist and secular humanist peers who see those numbers and champion them and celebrate. And for me, the concern comes from, others who look at those numbers and feel concern include like a lot of sociologists and demographers of religion who look at the rise of the nuns with worry, because there has long been a sort of correlation between religious identity and civic engagement in this country. So this is something that Robert Putnam at Harvard talks about in a lot of his work, which is that, he says that religious people are better neighbors than the non-religious. And what he means by that is that in the United States, religious people give more money to charity, both religious and secular charity, than the non-religious do. They vote at much higher levels than the non-religious do. Evangelical Christians, for example, have a voter registration rate that's 3 times higher than the nuns do. They are much more likely to sort of be involved in efforts for the common good, sort of in all these different areas, including in interfaith work. Religious communities and religious individuals tend to be more involved. And so a lot of sociologists then look at the rise of the nuns and feel sort of worry about that. But what I have come to learn as I've begun working with these sociologists over the last few years that I think is really interesting and is where my worry sort of resides, is as I said before, the nuns are a kind of big catch-all category. They include atheists, agnostics, secular humanists, and then nothing in particulars, as you mentioned earlier, John, which is the folks who, when asked what they believe or what their religious identity is, say, oh, nothing in particular. And if you break out those different subgroups, you actually find that atheists, agnostics, secular humanists are just as civically engaged as their religious peers, sometimes even more so. And it is the nothing in particulars that bring down the average of the entire group. So it's nothing in particulars that are sort of checking out of society. They have the lowest levels of education, they vote less, they volunteer less, all these different things. And that is where my concern lies, is that we have a growing number. And again, as you look at the rise of the nuns, you see the number of people who say that they're atheist or agnostic has grown a little, but it is the nothing in particulars that are kind of exploding. And my concern there is that you have a segment of the population that does not have spaces where they can turn to explore the big questions in life that we all need to wrestle with, to be held accountable to their beliefs, to be challenged, to ask themselves if they're living in the way that is sort of in alignment with their highest values. And my concern is a lot of these individuals are kind of piecing together a sense of community and belonging, and they are vulnerable to being targeted. I wrote a few years ago a piece for Vice on the growing number of religiously unaffiliated young white men who are moving into the alt-right and white supremacist movements, and how this is a population that is sort of adrift in society and is very vulnerable to being targeted by people with malicious intent. And so I don't worry about the rise of the religiously unaffiliated because I'm pro-religion, and I don't celebrate it because I'm anti-religion. My concern is, as we enter into a period in American life where we organize, how we sort of sift through some of the most central important questions in life, we're shifting away from doing that in these sort of traditions in which or these institutions in which we've historically done that work. And we're kind of entering into a build your own DIY spirituality kind of approach that's becoming much more popular. I think that there's a lot that we gain in that freedom, especially people who have felt the restrictive power of institutions weigh down most heavily on them. But that freedom can free us up in ways that aren't always great either. My mom is not theologically a Lutheran, but she belongs to a Lutheran church, and she goes on Sundays, not right now, obviously, but she goes on Sundays because it is a space where every week she kind of checks in with herself. She hears something that challenges her to ask herself if she is living in the way that she aspires to. All of these sort of really good functions of religion that I think those of us who have left religious institutions haven't quite figured out good ways, good structures for meeting those needs that are universal human needs, no matter where you fall on the religion spectrum. So I think when we think about polarization in this society, the thing that worries me is this population that's kind of adrift right now, and doesn't necessarily have spaces in their life that are dedicated to being challenged and to asking themselves the kinds of questions that we all need to wrestle with in order to be contributing members of this world that we all share.
Well, it sounds like you were quite prescient in your piece, for Vice that you wrote, and because a lot of that has manifested itself in this very volatile year and a half here, as we saw in Michigan and, of course, the Capitol on January 6th. Well, I know that several participants have questions. I want to get to those as quickly as possible. Our colleague Brianna is going to read some of them, and I'll try and get your voices in and try and get to as many of the questions as possible. So Brianna, please jump in.
Thanks, John, and thanks to all of you. Building off of what you were just saying, Chris, one of the questions that came in a little bit ago is, how in each of your traditions and values would you address the beliefs, values, and retaliatory and anti-democratic acts against others of the white supremacists and generally of misogynists, which seems particularly timely given what's happened earlier this week. So I would love to get each of your thoughts.
Tahil, why don't you start with that, and then we'll just quickly get all of your perspectives on that, please.
Yeah, sure. I think I just need to review it one more time because that was a mouthful. Yeah, so my traditions, both Hinduism and Sikhism, really try to address this with the idea that we should not be stepping into what is the political, just because it is what I think is sort of a blemish on what is a part of this process called creation and reality, because we know that there is a divisive nature to it, but there is a deep part of the Sikh tradition, particularly from its inception, that has always been about calling out what is tyrannical and what is unjust and what is oppressive. And that's been a part of the tradition of justice that I think Sikhism lives out on a daily basis. In Sikhism, there's this idea from Guru Gobind Singh Ji, who's the 10th Guru, as he was out on the battlefield himself, prayed that whenever there is a moment of righteousness, he prays that he has the blessing to be able to act on that righteousness at all times, that he may never refrain from it whenever there's an opportunity. And I think that's incumbent upon each of us to think about, where do we see those points of righteousness in what is going on? Why are we doing what's right? It's because it's the right thing to do, not because anyone is watching, not because it's convenient, not because it's the thing that will give us fame and glory. It's because it's what love looks like in public. It looks like justice, as Dr. Cornel West said. And I think from the Hindu tradition, there are interpretations and strands of that kind of an idea because we see the world as being very interconnected. I think it's about approaching this with a responsible form of solidarity that only doesn't show up at times of joy or doesn't only show up at times of sorrow. It shows up at every point when a community needs you. And that's where I think, unfortunately, both of those communities struggle in being able to do that because of what I said before in their sometimes insular and sometimes appeasing natures when trying to deal with the political nature of what might be going on in the world. With what happened in the attacks on Tuesday, particularly, I'm an Asian American. My mother works at a nail salon where she has given massages before. Because of the pandemic, she has not been working for the past year, but I know of the discrimination that she's faced just walking on the road. I wouldn't want my mother or any other ummah, any Korean mother or any mother to be able to face something like that. And it's not because I can empathize with the fact that it could have been my mother, but it is my Hindu and Sikh traditions that remind me that I am fighting for all mothers. I am fighting for their safety. I am fighting for their ability to thrive and be stable and to have the families that they want to have. And if I can't achieve that, I'm actually not practicing my religion.
Well, thank you for that, and very well said representation there. And Emmy, jump into that, please, if you will, from the Christian tradition. And if indeed this is part of a response that might not have the schisms between denominations and the degree this might be universal, or are there indeed divisions in terms of how, you know, different denominations might answer this question?
I think certain denominations would like to pretend there are different ways in which we would answer this question. I think the tragic honesty is that white supremacy continues to be a dominant, or at least a thick root in American practices of Christianity, no matter what denomination you subscribe to. We heard, you know, the critique of Sunday morning as the most segregated hour in America goes back to Martin Luther King. Obviously, it goes back much further when you consider the way Christianity was disseminated, but then also very tightly regulated among enslaved people in the South. The interesting thing, especially in the light of Tuesday's attacks, is that as friends and family of the shooter are being interviewed, particularly they're describing him as a person of strong Christian faith. And they're focusing very, very much on that Christian faith and that he apparently might have struggled with some kind of, they've termed it, I think, sexual addiction. Of course, that's a very convoluted term, and how we apply that is very messy. In the suggestion almost that these attacks were coordinated out of his rejection of his own sinfulness. And were therefore not misogynist or racist in any way. They were a reflection of, you know, I believe, unfortunately, we all know that one of the police officers described him as having a very bad day, which is, I think, white supremacy and misogyny inherent in that expression. 8 people had a very bad day in the sense that they were shot and killed. And yet we're focused on this humanizing statement. And I think one of the things that's interesting in that context is that Christianity, no matter what denomination you participate in, has a very, very tense relationship with sex and sexuality. even within perhaps the denominations that would like to think themselves very progressive, they're still constantly fighting ideas about purity and about what appropriate sexual contact between people looks like. We have sex scandals and we have sexual abuse happening in every denomination, so it's not denomination specific. I have some theories on why Christianity in particular participates in that. I don't know that it's not specific to Christianity, but especially as the dominant religion in this country and as the dominant political force, since we might still be 65% as far as population, but we are, I believe, more proportionately represented or more disproportionately represented in elected candidates. In particular, what I'm thinking is Christianity has done a very good job of turning our misogyny and our racism and any other practices of marginalization and oppression into individual occurrences of sin rather than systemic problems. When we fail to recognize how people in the church, individuals in the church, or the church as a whole are participating in systemic racism, are continuing to, practice even, passively, but practice a divided situation in which white people do not regularly engage with anybody within BIPOC communities. When we pretend that that is an individual failing rather than recognizing that we're participating in systemic problems, then we're continuing to perpetuate that white supremacy, that racism, that misogyny are not actual concerns, that it is simply the individual's level of sin. And that does not allow us to do the kind of transformative work that we need to do.
Thank you for that. And Chris, they wanted to hear from all three perspectives, so we certainly want to hear your thoughts on this question as well.
I'll keep it brief, but one thing I would say is, as people leave religious institutions, I think there's this idea that it's this kind of like magical transformation that happens. If you associate Christianity, for example, if you're leaving a Christian tradition and you associate Christianity with misogyny, with homophobia, with racism and white supremacy, and you leave religion, you think that you've sort of transformed yourself, and it can actually be that much easier to not interrogate your own complicity and the way that those things continue to live in you. And this is a thing I've seen play out again and again among non-religious people, is that there's this idea that that's a religion problem, and so that's not something that I need to interrogate within myself. And I think part of what motivated me to write that piece for Vice a few years ago was that Richard Spencer, who is the self-appointed founder of the alt-right, a very prominent white supremacist leader, himself an atheist, and did an interview with an atheist blog and talked about the relationship between his white supremacist ideas and his atheism. And atheist organizations, atheist groups really didn't say anything about it. And I felt that we have a responsibility, those of us who are active within those spaces, to name this, and especially sort of in light of the sort of overrepresentation of, like, there are a higher percentage of people in alt-right and white supremacist movements who identify as, or don't identify as, religious than in the general public. And so we have a responsibility to name and address those things. And I think we, part of the sort of one byproduct of the polarization that we've seen and the sort of politicization of Christianity in particular is that you can look at various, you can look at things like the sort of attack on the Capitol that happened, and you can say, well, that must have just been a group of extremist conservative Christians, but actually, and that can become a way for people who are not religious to, not have to sort of acknowledge that, our presence, our participation, our complicity, and address what's going on in our own community. And sure enough, there's been a huge, over the last 10 years especially, there have been major struggles within organized atheist spaces around sexism, around white supremacy, around things that I think, again, a lot of people maybe tell themselves that they've left behind when they've left religion. So yeah, I mean, I think again, there's much more I could say there, but I think that the conflation of some of those things like misogyny or homophobia with religion makes it easier for people who leave an institution to feel that their work is done. And that absolutely is not the case.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I'm going to get to another question. I may not go to all of you in each question, so we can get to as many as possible. So Brianna, if you could please go to the next one.
Yes, I think Tahil had mentioned his interest in answering this question, so I'll pick on that one first, which is, how do you, hopefully more than one person, perceive within religion the difference between a theology of convenience and a theology of acceptance, and how the two can or should coexist within religion?
Well, I think a theology of convenience is, it's a term that I kind of came up with in observing over the past several years, the approach that the religious right particularly has taken in being able to make the decisions that they do in dictating the narratives of what communities should believe, while at the same time behind the scenes, those in power and privilege actually make the complete opposite decisions in their personal lives. And I argue that it's speaking to a larger part of how we are really stretching the ideas of how our personal practices and how we conceive of the idea of our religion or spirituality can be stretched and molded based on what we think is convenient to us. There have been a number of different topics that have been brought up, I think, particularly by Emmy, about things like same-sex marriage, about like the traditional idea of the institution of marriage, and then coming from the Catholic tradition in particular, the amount of scandals of sexual abuse and pedophilia that have come out of the tradition that is fighting for this idea that this institution of a man and a woman is the most sacred thing. Yet they come out with this audacious form of religiosity that doesn't help us really look into letting people live the way that they should live as they're entirely meant to live. And if we're going to shift from a culture of convenience to a culture of acceptance, we have to prioritize courage. We need to stop being audacious in the steps that we take to embed ourselves in the world. And I think that the political tailspin that a lot of religious communities are taking in, harboring the sentiments of, things like racism, xenophobia, misogyny, and all of these things, it kind of hits them in the face sometimes. But then again, we don't see that as a part of the norm where we're holding them accountable. It's just the one among the few that happens to be picked out who is finally brought to justice. We aren't turning the framework of how our religious, communities really function by having accountable systems help them get through that process. If we're going to have a culture or a theology of acceptance, that actually means we have to accept what we are responsible for too. And if you are using that responsibility and that power to harm people, to oppress them, to keep them in places where they cannot be seen, then you need to be brought to the spotlight and held accountable too. And I speak to that, in a space where, again, since we don't have these systems in both Hinduism and Sikhism, many people who are considered powerful because of being religious, pious people get away with a lot because they are protected by folks that are complicit in their crimes, that are complicit in their harmful behaviors. And those patterns are just as much as the problem of that toxic person and the toxic culture that they're creating around them with the people who are complicit in that.
Thank you for sharing your perspective on that. And let's get to another question, please, Brianna.
Sounds good. How would any of you navigate and help grow interfaith communities while navigating a lot of the differences between people of different backgrounds?
Emmy, how about if you address that, please?
Sure. It's interesting. We're doing the same thing, whether we're creating an experience within a specific religious community or whether you're working within an interfaith community, right? You're looking for common language and a way to share experiences in ways that enrich the whole. You're looking for that whether you're forming, a bowling league or a Dungeons and Dragons group, right? Like you want people to come together and feel that they can share their experiences and participate in something. In particular, within an interfaith context, there's the desire both to create space where you can talk about your particular religious and spiritual experiences, but not be expected to speak on behalf of the whole. Unless, obviously, when you're curating a panel, we're working on that. But if you're trying to create a community that does that, you do not want every individual in the room to feel like they have to speak on behalf of their entire belief structure, ethnic background, country of origin, etc. So we'd have to create a space in which you can ask questions and also be okay with saying, I don't know, which for religious folks can be very, very hard. Again, as Chris reflected, that might go much better within contexts that are agnostic or none of the above. Tahil has recognized how that works particularly better within Hinduism. Judaism is very comfortable with questions. A good number of forms of Christianity are not particularly comfortable with not knowing the answer. And that, religious orthodoxy and a search for it occurs in every religion. So to create that space of being able to say, I don't know, and to be able to ask questions that are not comments masquerading as a question, if I might phrase it that way, where we say like, well, how could you believe such and such? And someone says, oh, you really shouldn't. Well, I was just asking. Were you? Because the tone of your voice suggested that you were trying to be argumentative. So if we could create, that kind of courageous, brave, but also protected space in which people feel like they can ask questions that are open-ended and curious, and where people can say, here's my experience, and feel that that's going to be trusted and held in confidence, and also be able to say, you know what, I don't actually know, and that's an interesting question. Can I get back to you next week?
Terrific. Thank you for sharing that. And Brianna, let's try and get to another one here in our remaining minutes, please.
Yes, I'll pick one for Chris. This was asked earlier, I think, when you were talking toward the beginning. So, Chris, can you explain more of what you see as a movement toward a loose network?
Sure. Yeah, so that was when I was talking about sort of how we structure society. And, I think this was something that Emmy talked about, for example, for a lot of the history, much of the history of the United States, Sunday morning was, you would go to church, and obviously this was never the case for everyone in this country, but for dominant groups in particular, you went to church on a Sunday morning. That was where you found your community. That was where you learned more about the world around you. That was where you plugged in. And now, we sort of meet our various needs in all kinds of different ways. We go online to find a sense of community, to process major events, to learn more about the world around us. And that in some ways, there's a kind of fragmentation that happens there. That again can be as sort of liberating for many as it can be, it can put a lot of burden on the individual as well, to have to sort of work to find ways to meet all of your own needs, rather than being able to go to one place and know that if you're trying to sift through some big question, you can find support and care. And so, yeah, loose networks are sort of the groups that we build around ourselves to meet our varying needs. And as we talk about this, I just think about that last question in particular, sort of how we build these kinds of interfaith spaces. The reality is there's sort of capital I interfaith, where we're creating intentional opportunities for people to engage these different aspects of our identities, much like we're doing here today. But all of life is interfaith. Not to oversimplify it, but we're constantly navigating difference. Every relationship we're in is an interfaith relationship in some way. Even someone who, sort of shares our worldview largely, there are as many Christianities as there are Christians in the world. There are as many atheisms as there are atheists in the world. And, I think as we navigate these various kinds of loose networks or networks, whether they're sort of more structured or less structured, the one of the most helpful and important things we can do is to return to, a kind of curiosity about where someone else is coming from, rather than a sort of a mode of interrogation of saying, you need to explain yourself to me, you need to justify yourself to me. People will ask every now and then if it's like complicated or hard to date somebody who believes so strongly in Christianity that they are, getting ordained this year. And what I have found really fruitful about our relationship is that we may have some different sort of like working theories. I would say neither of us has like set in stone answers about everything, but we have different working ideas about the nature of existence. But we both believe that the questions matter, and we both think that it is important to live a life in which you are constantly trying to sort of better deepen your understanding of the world around you, of the people that you encounter, and that kind of curiosity helps open you up to a deeper understanding of others and of yourself. And I think that is going to be, as we move out of this more sort of institutional way of structuring society into, navigating these often very chaotic, loose networks that we all move through online and off, attending to and cultivating a kind of curiosity in ourselves, I think is going to be essential to being able to navigate that kind of a world. And I'm really grateful for this conversation we've had today, because I see, in my fellow panelists, such an embodiment of that curiosity and such evidence of the richness that kind of curiosity can add to your life. So I appreciate you for modeling that for me and for all of us.
Well, Chris, I echo that appreciation of you as Emmy and Tahil and certain Brianna and all of you who joined us online. And you also mentioned curiosity, and oh my goodness, so many ways to explore this issue that, I feel privileged to be able to sate some of that curiosity by asking questions. I know we didn't get to all of them here. I think Tahil perhaps typed in before if people had questions offline to feel free to contact him, putting you on the spot, Chris and Emmy, but I assume you're open to email questions as well. So for those who took part today, if you want to directly ask one or all three of the panelists questions, please feel very free to do so. I'm grateful for all of you for joining me both on the panel and again online. We have one more event that'll take place in this series on polarization and identities on April 15th. I hope you join us then. Hope you come with your questions. And I appreciate all of your interest and interesting questions today. Thank you very much and have a great day.